Hello everyone, this is Saurabh, and today we are reading a story written or rewritten by Lu Xun. This story is a very famous ancient mythological story in China which is called Nüwa Mends Heaven. Before we read this story, let us understand about Chinese mythology. In Chinese mythology, Nüwa is considered as the mother goddess or the emperor god. She is credited with creating humanity and repairing the pillar of heaven. The Huanzi tells an ancient story about how the four pillars that supported the sky crumbled inexplicably. Other sources have tried to explain the cause, which was maybe the battle between Kong Kong and Chuangshu or Churong, and unable to accept his defeat, Kong Kong deliberately banged his head onto Mount Puzhou, which was one of the four pillars that was holding heaven. So half of the sky fell, which created a gaping hole, and the earth also was cracked. Now the earth's axis was tilted into the southeast, while the sky rose into the northwest. And this is also considered to be the reason why the western region of China is higher than the eastern region, and most of its rivers flow towards the southeast. And the same explanation is also applied to the sun, moon, and stars, which moved into the northwest. So, in this story, a wildfire burned the forest and led the wild animals to run amok and attack innocent people, while the water which was coming out from earth's crack didn't seem to be slowing down. So what Nüwa did, Nüwa pitied the humans she had made and attempted to repair the sky. So she gathered 5 colored stones, red, yellow, blue, black and white, from the riverbed, melted them and used them to patch up the sky, to mend the sky or mend the heaven. Since then the sky have been colorful because of these 5 colored stones she took from riverbed. So she then killed a giant turtle or tortoise. So some versions also call the tortoise as O, cut off the 4 legs of the creature to use as the new pillars to support the sky. So she cut off the turtle's 4 legs so that it could support the sky on its 4 sides. But Nüwa was not able to do it perfectly because of unequal length of legs made the sky tilt. So it was not, the legs were not cut perfectly, so the sky tilted somewhere up and down. So after this job was done, she drove away the wild animals, extinguished the fire and controlled the flood with huge amount of ashes from burning reeds, and the world became peaceful as before. Now Lu Xun rewrote this story in 1922. Lu Xun is a reformist writer in China, and his stories are filled with sarcasm for his disregard of traditional Chinese culture and the people who have become so adamant in sticking to the traditional Chinese culture rather than taking a modern view of life. So in this story, Lu Xun rewrites this mythological story as saying that people have become so ambitious, fighting each other and blaming their miseries on heaven. So it's everything is heaven's fault, everything is God's fault, which made a gap in heaven. Basically, Lu Xun is trying to say that it's people who are more interested in blaming heaven for their miseries and their acts. So let's go on and read the story Mending Heaven. This is a mythological story which is rewritten as a satire or sarcasm to modern Chinese society in 1920s and 30s. Mending Heaven, Part 1. Nüwa started awake as if from a dream, but a dream she instantly forgot on regaining consciousness. All she could remember was a sense of vexation, of an insufficiency of something, and an excess of something else. A mild breeze, warm with the morning sun, fanned her life force through the universe. She rubbed her eyes. A mass of green serpentine clouds wove their way through a powder pink sky, a backdrop of stars blinking away at them. The sun blazed light over the blood red clouds on the horizon, like a golden ball petrified in ancient lava. A frigid white moon, the color of pig iron, hung opposite. As to which was rising and which was setting, she paid no attention. The ground was carpeted in pastel green. Even the evergreens, the pines and cypresses, had a youthful fragility to them. Bent down far enough, and a mass of pink and bluish white flowers, the size of ladles, drew into focus. Pull back, and they swam out into a variegated mist. I have never been so bored in my life, she thought to herself, springing to her feet and stretching her perfectly rounded arms, vibrant with energy, to the sky. As she yawned, the heavens responded by paling to a mystical flesh pink, momentarily merging the goddess into her background. She walked through the pink universe to the seashore, her curvaceous form now melting into the rosinate ocean, her waist lightening to a pure white. The waves, taken by surprise, rose and fell in orderly rhythm, drenching her in spray. She simmered palely through the water as if about to dissolve into the brine. Oblivious to her surroundings, she knelt down, scooped up some mud, and after a little pressing and kneading, held in the palm of her hand a tiny creature, almost exactly in her image. She exclaimed, not quite able to believe she was its author, as if it had been lying in the mud all along, waiting for her to pick it up. All the same, the unexpectedness of it all made her happy, and on she went with her work, with a new sense of courage and joy, blowing sweating life into her figurines. The tiny creatures began to yelp. She exclaimed in surprise again, and something streamed out from every pore of her body. The ground was now covered in a milky white vapor. By the time she had recovered from her abstraction, her creatures had also fallen silent. Sky, Lord, some began to babble. My precious things, she stared at them, prodding at one of their fat white faces with a muddy finger. They gurgled with laughter. The first laughter she had heard in the universe, and for the first times her lips curled unstoppably into a smile. She stroked her creatures as she made them. To begin with, they circled around her, but gradually they wandered further and further away, and had more and more to say for themselves, until she was no longer able to understand them. Her ears filled with clamorous noise, till she was dizzy with it. She wearied through all this delight. In time, she began to feel she had no more breath with which to infuse them, no more sweat to drip onto them. Her head thickened, her vision clouded, her cheeks flushed, her joyful excitement left her. All she felt was impatience. But on she went, tirelessly, manufacturing as if she had lost all sense of what she was doing. Eventually, a cramp in her legs forced her to stand up. Leaning against a bare mountain, she looked up. The sky was dappled with clouds, like white fish scales against the brooding dark green below. Registering an unaccountable twinge of dissatisfaction, she reached out to pluck a wisteria vine, heavy with cluster of wondrously plumpy purple flowers that stretched to the horizon from the mountainside. When she shook it, the vine collapsed over the ground, scattering lilac petals. She dragged the wisteria this way and that, spraying droplets of mud about her. As they fell to the earth, they turned into yet more tiny creatures, similar to the kind she had already fashioned, but this time rather duller, uglier, less appealing than the early batch, with Weasley heads and rat's eyes. But she went obliviously on, seized by a restless fascination with her task, her hands frantic with the mischief they were making. As she swung it even faster, the vine writhed muddily over the ground like a scalded snake. Drops of clay flew like rain, transforming into bowling little creatures in mid-air, swarming the instant they hit the ground. Barely conscious of her actions, she flicked the branch more and more wildly, but her back, legs, and arms began to fail her. She squatted down on the ground, resting her head against the mountain, her black hair spreading over its summit. She sighed after catching her breath back, her eyes closed. The wisteria dropped from her hands to the ground, sprawling limply over the earth, as if exhausted. She was awoken by a crash, the rupture of heaven and earth, finding herself slipping southeastwards. Nüwa tried to steady herself, but stepped into a void. She grabbed at a mountain top to prevent herself from toppling forward. She felt water, sand, and rocks pouring down on her from behind. When she glanced over her shoulders, her mouth and ears filled with water. Quickly looking down, she discovered the ground shaking beneath her feet. Thankfully, it settled again, giving her a chance to edge backwards and find a place to sit. Wiping the water from her forehead and eyes, she began to study the situation. All was confusion. Great cascades of water, crested with occasional sharp swells, smothered the earth, the ocean, she presumed. She waited, perplexed, eventually all calmed, though the great waves still soared up as high as the mountains had previously risen. Where once there might have been dry land, bone like ridges of stone jutted out. Glancing out over the sea, she spotted a range of peaks rushing towards her, whirling about on the waves. Seizing hold of it before it could stub her toes, she discovered an accumulation of strange creatures covering face down in the intervening valleys. She drew the mountains in towards her for closer examination. The ground around these beings was covered in expectorations of various substances, gold and jade dust, perhaps intermingled with cypress leaves and fish, chewed to a pulp. One by one, they slowly raised their heads to meet Nüwa's wide eyed stare. It eventually dawned on her that these were her very own creatures. And yet they had changed. Some had covered their bodies in extraordinary ways. while others trailed long white hairs from their chins, matted by brine into tendrils, resembling elongated poplar leaves. She exclaimed, her skin prickling with startled fear, as if she had just touched a hairy caterpillar. Save us, goddess, one of the hairier specimens begged brokenly as he vomited, looking up at her. Save us, your humble subjects are questing for immortality. But this catastrophe, the rending of heaven and earth, by your mercy you have come. Please save our puny lives. Grant us the elixir of life. Then he went in for a curious jerking of his head to and from the ground. What? She asked in bafflement. Then a great many of their number followed suit, opening their mouths now to vomit, now to chant, Goddess, Goddess, all doing that strange thing with their heads. The noise quickly became vexing, and she began rather to regret getting involved, as they seemed a bothersome bunch. Looking helplessly around her, she was overjoyed to find a team of fabulous giant turtles frolicking in the ocean nearby. Take them somewhere safe, she ordered, resting the mountains on their carapaces. Nodding at her, they gathered into a shoal and swam off into the distance. But she had drawn the beak towards her too violently, dislodging one of the white haired creatures of his valley. Unable to climb back or to swim, he lay face down on the seashore, slapping at his face. Though there was something rather pitiful about him, Nüwa was too preoccupied to intervene further. Heaving a sigh of partial relief, she looked back around her. The waters had receded some distance, exposing expanses of earth and rock. Yet more creatures seemed to be inled into cracks in the stone, some stiffly motionless, others moving about. She peered at one staring stupidly at her. Its body was entirely encased with iron plates, its face a mask of fear and dejection. What has happened? She asked. Alas, heaven has cursed us, it told her despairingly. When the treacherous Chu rose up against our king, he fought back as heaven willed. We did battle outside the city, yet heaven forsook our virtuous cause, and our forces were repelled. What? This indeed was a novelty. Our forces were repelled, and our king dashed his brain out against the broken mountain, smashing the pillar of heaven between earth and sky. Oh, whoa, whoa, that's quite enough of your nonsense. She turned towards another of the creatures, again encased in iron plate, but its face beaming with triumph. How about you tell me what has been going on here? She now realized how various the faces of her creatures were. Perhaps she would get more sense out of this one. The perfidious swine Kang Hui coveted the throne of heaven. Our king fought back as heaven willed it. We did battle outside the city, and heaven did not forsake our virtuous cause. Our forces marched to victory, while Kang Hui met his end on the broken mountain. What? She spluttered, as confused as before. The perfidious, enough. You are both as bad as each other. Flushing with anger, she turned on her heel and went elsewhere in search of an answer. Eventually, she spied a creature unencumbered by iron plates, naked, except for a ragged cloth around his waist and covered in bleeding. Though he was busy untying another tattered piece of cloth from another, apparently rigid specimen's waist and wrapping it around himself, his face was devoid of expression. Supposing that he was of a different species to those encased in iron plate, she hoped finally to extract a little intelligible information out of him. "What has been going on?" she asked. "What's been going on?" he echoed, barely looking up. "All this trouble, all this trouble." "Has there been a war?" She tried supplying an answer. "War?" he asked back, turning her face to the sky. Nüwa took a deep mouthful of cold air. An enormous deep gash ran across the heaven. She stood up and tapped it, her fingernail rapping dully against it, as against a cracked bowl. Frowning, she looked pensively about her for a while. Then, wringing the water from her hair, she threw it back over her shoulders and summoned up her energy to gather reeds. The first thing to be done, she had resolved, was to mend the sky. Day and night she piled up reeds, growing thin with the work, for the earth was no longer as it had once been. Whenever she looked up, the cracked heavens lay above her. Looking down, she found only the rotting ruins of the earth, empty of all that had once gladdened her heart. Once the tower of reeds stretched up to the breach in the heavens, she began to look for blue stones. First, she searched for stones of pure azure that would match the sky, but there weren't enough of them on earth. Disinclined to use up the mountains, she sometimes scavenged for fragments in more populated parts, where she met mockery or insult, or where the stones were snatched back, her hand bitten. Soon she resorted to mixing in white stones, and when she ran out of those, she tried orange and grey, until the crack was filled. Now, when all she had to do was light a fire to smelt them together, her eyes clouded over with fatigue, her ears buzzed. She could go on no longer. "I have never been so bored in my life," she panted, sitting on a mountain peak and resting her head in her hands. The ancient forest on Kunlun mountain still burned red on the western horizon. Glancing across at it, she decided to pluck a tree to light the pile of reeds. But as she reached out, something pricked her toe. Looking down, she discovered another of these creatures of hers, even more bizarre looking than the others. It was copiously draped in cloth, with perhaps an extra dozen strip of material hanging from its waist, while its head was covered in some other fabric. A small black rectangular board sat on the crown of its head, while it prodded her foot with the flat object in its head, and there it stood between her legs, looking up at her. The instant it saw her look down at him, it hurriedly passed the flat object up to her. It was, she discovered as she took it from him, a tablet of smooth green bamboo inscribed with 2 lines of tiny black specks, finer even than the patterns on oak leaves, she thought admiringly. "What's this?" she asked, prickling with curiosity. "Your wanton nakedness demonstrates a failure of morality, contempt for the rights, and breach of the rules," the creature recited fluently, pointing at the tablet. "Such conduct is for birds and beasts only. The law of the land expressly prohibited." Gazing down at the board on top of his head, Nüwa smiled at her own foolishness. Dialogue with these creatures, experience had taught her, was quite impossible. Giving up on the conversation, she placed the tablet on top of the headboard, then set about uprooting a vast burning trunk from the forest fire to introduce to her pile of reeds. She heard a strange new noise, a sobbing sound. She glanced down. The tiny eyes beneath the rectangular board held two tears, smaller than mustard seeds. Because the creature's cries bore so little resemblance to the wails she had heard earlier, she had not realized that it too was weeping. She lit the fire in several places. It did not catch instantly, for there was still some dampness to the reeds, but after much crackling, countless tongues of flame began curling out, stretching up before falling back, eventually magnifying into double-headed flowers, then into a great pillar of fire overshadowing the glow from Kunlun mountain. A sudden strong gust of wind bellowed the column of flame into life, spinning it around. The variously colored stones reddened, then bolted liquidly, eternally through the crack. Like malt sugar, the wind and fire buffeted her hair in all directions, the sweat cascading off her. Her body stood in silhouette against the blaze, coloring the universe for the last time, a fleshly pink. The fire slowly travelled up the reeds, leaving behind it only a pile of ashes. When the heaven was once more its uniform greenish blue, she reached out to feel it. I'll try again, she thought to herself, dissatisfied with its uneven finish. When I am feeling stronger, she bent down to gather up the reed ashes, dousing large handfuls of them in the flood waters. Billows of steam hissed up from the residual heat, spattering her body with discolored water. Soon the wind joined in, picking up dust and painting her in grey. She breathed her last. The sun blazed light over blood-red horizon like a golden ball, petrified in ancient lava. A frigidly off-white moon, the color of pig iron, hung opposite. As to which was rising and which was setting, who could tell? The exhausted shell of her body lay lifeless between them. All around, a silence deeper than death reigned. One bitterly cold day, the ground hummed with commotion. The long delayed arrival of the imperial guards, who had been waiting for the fire and dust to subside. A yellow X proceeded to the left of their phalanx. Back to the right, a vast ancient banner unfurled behind them as they dodged and feinted their way towards Nüwa's corpse. Their caution was unnecessary. There was no trace of life. They cleverly chose to pitch camp on her stomach, as this was the most fertile place on her body. But then came a sudden change of heart. Claiming they were Nüwa's only true descendants, they now revised the text on their banner, the ancient character dropping like tadpole tails to the entrails of Nüwa. The aged Taoist priest stranded on the seashore enlightened generations of disciples only on his deathbed. However, did he reveal that the magic mountains had been carried out to sea on the backs of giant turtles. And his disciples told their disciples, and so on it went, until an ambitious alchemist begged to inform the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, who sent him off in search. The alchemist found nothing. The emperor died. Emperor Wu of the Han dispatched his own search party, but still nothing was found. It was probably just happy coincidence that the turtles nodded when they did. Probably they understood none of Nüwa's instruction. After swimming in aimless formation for a while, the shoal doubtless dispersed to sleep, leaving the magic mountains to sink. No one has discovered a trace of them since. Only the occasional island of savages.